The trucks rattled down a dusty road in the American South. Packed inside were dozens of captured German soldiers, their uniforms grimy, their faces gaunt from weeks of retreat and surrender. They sat in tense silence, shoulders stiff, eyes darting toward the horizon. Each man was consumed by the same dread. What awaited them on the other side of those gates? Nazi propaganda had been relentless. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and officers' speeches had warned them that surrender to the Allies meant certain brutality. Americans, they were told, were cowards in battle but cruel in victory. They would starve their prisoners, beat them, and treat them worse than animals. To many of the men bouncing in the truck bed, this journey was not a transport, it was a death march in disguise. The convoy finally stopped in front of a sprawling camp ringed with barbed wire. Guard towers loomed above, casting long shadows across rows of wooden barracks. The men climbed down slowly, their boots crunching on gravel, their hands trembling. Some clutched rosaries. Others muttered prayers under their breath. They braced for blows, for shouts, for the indignities of defeat. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of the bark of rifles or the sting of rifle butts, they were met by American guards holding trays. On those trays sat steaming mugs of coffee and stacks of fresh donuts. Nearby, Red Cross volunteers, many of them women, offered cigarettes, smiling faintly as they lit them for the stunned prisoners. The Germans froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. One soldier blinked at the powdered sugar clinging to his fingers, as though he expected it to turn into ash. Another held a cigarette between his lips, his hand trembling so much that the American guard struck the match for him. Laughter rippled awkwardly through the group, a nervous, bewildered laughter. This was not what they had prepared themselves for. Where was the brutality? Where were the tortures they had been promised? Instead, they were being handed pastries, coffee, and tobacco, the very symbols of comfort and normalcy. One prisoner muttered under his breath, half in disbelief, half in wonder, "If this is defeat, it tastes sweet." It was a moment that shattered illusions. For years, these men had been taught to see America as decadent and weak, its people soft and corrupt. Yet here, in the first hours of captivity, they experienced a power far more unsettling than cruelty, kindness. The central question loomed: why would the Americans treat their enemies this way? Why, in the midst of a brutal war, would they offer cigarettes and donuts instead of punishment? The answer lay in a mixture of policy, strategy, and psychology. America adhered to the Geneva Convention more strictly than most. It saw humane treatment not only as a moral obligation but as a weapon in itself, a quiet, subversive way to break the hold of Nazi propaganda and encourage surrender. And beneath it all was something deeper, a reflection of America's abundance, its confidence, and its belief that even war could not strip away humanity. For the German prisoners, this realization was the beginning of a transformation. What started with coffee and a donut would grow into something much larger, the collapse of everything they had been told about their enemy. By the middle of World War II, German soldiers were being captured in staggering numbers. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy and the snowy forests of the Ardennes, entire units of the Wehrmacht and even elite Waffen-SS troops laid down their arms. The United States, once dismissed by Nazi propaganda as too soft for serious war, suddenly found itself in possession of hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were transported across the Atlantic to camps in the United States. They arrived in waves, first from North Africa after Rommel's defeat, later from France after D-Day, and finally from the collapsing Reich itself. For many Germans, the voyage to America was filled with dread. Their fears were not unfounded. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted a terrifying picture of Allied captivity. Radio broadcasts warned that the Americans were savages in uniform, who would torment prisoners and starve them to death. Newspapers and officers drilled into soldiers that surrender was worse than death, that capture meant humiliation, and that the Americans would strip them of all dignity. Even before facing capture, soldiers whispered that anyone shipped to the United States would simply vanish, never to return. Adding to this fear was what the Germans themselves had done. They knew how their army had treated prisoners, especially on the Eastern Front. Soviet POWs had been left to freeze in open fields, starved in mass camps, or executed outright. To German soldiers, it seemed natural to expect revenge in kind. If they had inflicted cruelty, surely cruelty awaited them. The grimness of these expectations cannot be overstated. When captured men boarded ships bound for America, many wrote farewell notes they never expected to send, believing they would never see their homeland again. Some clung to the idea that at least in death, their honor would remain intact. But what awaited them was not the hell they had imagined. Instead of brutality, they found something closer to order and routine: barbed wire and guard towers, yes, but also barracks, kitchens, and even work details where they earned wages. Instead of starvation, they found food. Instead of isolation, they discovered letters from home arriving through Red Cross channels. And more than anything, they found small gestures that bewildered them. Cigarettes handed out casually, donuts offered by Red Cross volunteers, coffee steaming in tin mugs. These details were not accidents. They reflected America's adherence to the Geneva Convention, its vast industrial resources, and a deliberate strategy to treat prisoners humanely, to undermine Nazi propaganda, and to encourage surrender rather than resistance. This approach had a profound psychological effect. Soldiers who had steeled themselves for torment instead found themselves putting on weight in captivity. Men who had feared the worst now spoke in disbelief about the kindness of their captors. One prisoner later admitted, "We expected chains. We received donuts." The story of German POWs in America is not just a tale of military logistics. It is a story of expectations shattered, of ideology colliding with reality. It reveals how, in the midst of one of the most brutal wars in history, something as simple as a cigarette or a pastry could become a weapon of psychological warfare. For many Germans, the first days of captivity marked the beginning of a transformation. They saw that the enemy they had been taught to hate was not weak, not decadent, but strong enough to fight fiercely and generous enough to treat even its enemies with humanity. And yet, those first moments of capture were only the beginning. To truly understand the shock German prisoners experienced, we must return to their mindset before surrender, to the world of fear and propaganda they carried with them as they stepped into American custody. In war, fear is often as powerful a weapon as bullets or bombs. For German soldiers in the 1940s, one of the deepest fears was capture, not simply because it meant defeat, but because of what they had been taught would follow. By the time many found themselves staring down American rifles or marching under guard, they were convinced they were walking into a nightmare. This fear was carefully cultivated by the Nazi regime. Propaganda was not a sideshow of the Third Reich. It was one of its central pillars. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, understood the power of shaping perception. From newspapers to films to radio broadcasts, the German public, and especially its soldiers, was saturated with the message that their enemies were monsters. Americans, the propaganda declared, were decadent materialists, lacking discipline and honor. They were portrayed as racially impure, governed by Jews, and corrupted by capitalism. Films depicted them as clumsy soldiers who relied on machines rather than courage, men who could never match the martial spirit of a German fighting man. But alongside this mockery was a darker warning. When these weak but cruel enemies captured you, they would take their revenge. Torture, starvation, and humiliation were presented as inevitabilities. This narrative found fertile ground because it played upon truths German soldiers already knew, truths about themselves. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht and SS had treated Soviet prisoners with unimaginable cruelty. Millions of Red Army soldiers died in German captivity, left to starve, freeze, or be executed outright. German soldiers had seen this, participated in it, or at the very least heard about it. It seemed only natural to them that their enemies would answer in kind. As a result, the fear of capture was not only propaganda, it was projection. Men believed they would be treated as they themselves had treated others. The contrast between East and West added another layer to this fear. Tales of Soviet brutality spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers who escaped from the Eastern Front whispered of massacres, of prisoners marched into Siberia, of endless labor camps where survival was unlikely. To many Germans, the Soviets were not merely enemies. They were the embodiment of vengeance, coming to repay 4 years of atrocities in kind. And so, when capture by the Americans loomed, most soldiers assumed it would be no different. Why should the Western allies, who had endured bombing raids, invasions, and the deaths of their sons, show any more mercy than the Russians? The expectation was clear: cruelty awaited. Testimonies from captured Germans reveal this state of mind with startling clarity. One prisoner later recalled the moment he boarded a ship in North Africa, bound for America. "We were sure we were going to die there. They would work us until we fell or simply throw us into the sea. None of us believed we would ever see Germany again." Another soldier, taken after the Battle of the Bulge, remembered trembling as he handed over his weapon, convinced an American GI would shoot him on the spot. Instead, the GI handed him a cigarette. These small acts of humanity were shocking precisely because they ran so counter to expectation. But in those first moments of capture, before reality set in, most Germans could not imagine such kindness. Their minds were filled with grim images: beatings, chains, and starvation. Many soldiers even considered suicide rather than capture, a last act of control in a world they believed would soon collapse around them. This dread was reinforced by the hierarchy of the German military itself. Officers constantly warned their men that surrender meant dishonor, not only for the soldier but also for his family. Hitler himself declared repeatedly that a German must fight to the last bullet. In 1944, he issued orders that any man who surrendered should be considered a traitor. Those who gave up willingly risked execution by their own comrades before they ever reached enemy hands. But propaganda and fear have their limits. When defeat became inevitable, whether in Tunisia, Normandy, or the Ardennes, German soldiers had no choice but to test their assumptions. And that was when the shock came. Early encounters tell us much about this collision between expectation and reality. Prisoners captured in North Africa braced themselves for blows when they arrived at American lines, only to find medics bandaging their wounds. Men captured in France expected to be marched into ditches and shot. Instead, they were loaded into trucks, handed food, and moved to processing centers. These experiences spread by word of mouth, slowly undermining the terror that Nazi propaganda had built. Still, in the early stages, disbelief remained. One American guard later recalled watching new prisoners tremble as they were given their first rations. They ate with suspicion, convinced the food might be poisoned. Another GI remembered handing a prisoner a cigarette, only for the man to burst into tears, muttering that it was some kind of cruel trick. This clash of perception and reality is essential to understanding why the POW experience in America left such a lasting impression. The Germans did not come into captivity as blank slates. They came burdened with years of indoctrination and the memory of their own army's brutality. Against that backdrop, even the simplest gesture, coffee in a tin cup, a donut, a cigarette, was powerful enough to feel like a miracle. And it was only the beginning. Once they reached the United States, many German prisoners discovered an entirely new reality waiting for them. Camps are not of cruelty, but of order. Barracks not of starvation, but of stability. And comforts that no German soldier could have imagined in the final, starving years of the war. When the barbed wire gates finally closed behind them, German POWs braced for the torment they had been promised. Yet what they encountered inside American camps was not cruelty, but a strange new world. One that left them bewildered, suspicious, and eventually, profoundly changed. Across the United States, from the pine forests of Georgia to the wide fields of Iowa and the plains of Texas, hundreds of POW camps sprang up seemingly overnight. They were not luxury resorts. Barracks were simple wooden huts. Heat was limited, and guards kept watch from towers. But compared to the horrors many Germans had envisioned, these places felt almost unreal. Food was the first and most powerful shock. Each prisoner was issued meals that complied with the Geneva Convention: bread, meat, vegetables, and sometimes fruit or dessert. Even in 1944 to 45, as Germany starved, these rations were substantial. Some camps even served eggs and fresh milk from local farms. A soldier who had gone weeks living on watery soup suddenly found himself sitting at a long table with a tray of hot food, more than he could finish. One prisoner later wrote, astonished, "I weighed 130 pounds when I was captured. After 1 year in America, I weighed 160. Another joked bitterly. I gained more in an American cage than I had lost in Hitler's army. Beyond the basics, there were small, symbolic luxuries. Cigarettes, handed out freely by guards, quickly became the unofficial currency of camp life. For men who had smoked ration scraps back home, American cigarettes seemed like treasure. They traded them for favors, used them in card games, and saved them as tokens of normalcy. Then there were the donuts. At many camps, the American Red Cross or USO volunteers set up stations where prisoners were served coffee and fresh pastries. For German soldiers, who had not tasted real sugar in years, the shock was indescribable. A single bite of a glazed donut seemed almost decadent, an indulgence more powerful than any weapon. Prisoners remembered the sweetness decades later, recalling it as the moment they realized their captivity was nothing like the nightmare they had feared. Entertainment added to this surreal experience. Camps often had libraries stocked with English and German books, sports fields for soccer or baseball, and even orchestras formed by the prisoners themselves. On warm evenings, American guards would sometimes set up projectors, showing Hollywood films. Prisoners sat in the glow of the screen, watching comedies, westerns, and musicals, windows into a culture they had been told was corrupt and empty. To their surprise, it was vibrant, funny, and strangely appealing. Work was another revelation. Many prisoners were assigned to local farms, factories, or construction projects, where they earned small wages. They labored under guard, but they were not abused. On farms, American families sometimes shared food or even conversation. Children gawked at the enemy soldiers harvesting crops in their fields, while farmers offered sandwiches or fruit. For men raised on years of indoctrination about American cruelty, this hospitality was disarming. Letters reinforced the message. The Red Cross facilitated mail between POWs and their families back in Germany. A soldier could write home and weeks later receive a reply confirming that his wife and children were alive. In the dark uncertainty of war, that connection was priceless. Families in Germany, reading these letters, were often stunned. Their loved ones in America described conditions better than those they faced at home. The psychological impact of these experiences was immense. The POWs had been prepared for beatings. Instead, they were treated with a degree of dignity. They expected starvation. Instead, they were better fed than many German civilians. They anticipated isolation. Instead, they found community, even recreation. Each act of generosity chipped away at the wall of fear and indoctrination that Nazi propaganda had built. But this was not simply charity. American policymakers understood the strategic value of humane treatment. By following the Geneva Convention and offering comforts, they encouraged surrender. German soldiers learned that if they laid down their arms, they would live, eat, and perhaps even thrive. This reduced resistance on the battlefield, saving American lives. In this sense, a donut or a cigarette was as much a weapon of war as a rifle. It broke the enemy's will without a shot being fired. Of course, not every experience was positive. Some guards were harsh, some camps were overcrowded, and not all Americans welcomed the sight of enemy soldiers working in their communities. There were incidents of hostility, even violence. Yet the overwhelming pattern was one of order, restraint, and humanity. The contrast to German treatment of their own captives could not have been more striking. Where Soviet POWs had been starved to death in open fields, Germans in America were playing soccer, eating donuts, and listening to jazz. The comparison gnawed at them. How could their enemy, portrayed as weak and corrupt, be so strong, so confident, that they could treat even prisoners with abundance? For many POWs, this was the first crack in the worldview they had carried from Germany. One man later confessed, "We thought we would be beaten like animals. Instead, we were treated like men. It was then I began to wonder, what else had they lied to us about?" In the end, the reality of American captivity was not only survival, it was transformation. The food, the cigarettes, and the donuts were more than comforts. They were symbols. They symbolized a society wealthy enough to feed its enemies, confident enough to show humanity, and strong enough to wage war without surrendering to cruelty. It was a reality so at odds with Nazi propaganda that it left many German prisoners stunned. And in that shock lay the seeds of something even larger, the collapse of an entire belief system. For German prisoners, the first weeks of captivity in America were bewildering. But as the months stretched into years, their confusion hardened into a realization that went far deeper than food or shelter. What collapsed inside those barbed wire fences was not simply fear of brutality. It was the very scaffolding of Nazi propaganda. Inside Germany, they had been told relentlessly that America was a nation of cowards and degenerates, incapable of serious war. They had been told its people were lazy, its culture was corrupt, and its soldiers would crumble before the disciplined might of the Wehrmacht. But captivity revealed a startlingly different picture. One of the most powerful shocks came from culture itself. In Germany, jazz and swing had been labeled degenerate music, associated with racial mixing and moral decay. The Nazis banned it, censored it, and punished those who played it. Yet in American camps, radios sometimes crackled with swing bands, and guards whistled Glenn Miller tunes while walking the perimeter. For young German soldiers who had secretly loved these rhythms before the war, hearing them openly celebrated was electrifying. Letters and diaries show that many POWs described American music as a revelation. One recalled sitting in a camp recreation hall, listening to Benny Goodman records. It was as if the walls of propaganda cracked. This music was free, alive. It made us question why we had been told it was dangerous. Other cultural shocks came in more mundane forms. Coffee steaming in the mornings, donuts fried fresh by Red Cross volunteers, cigarettes distributed with casual abundance. These small comforts carried enormous symbolic weight. In Germany, civilians were already scraping by on ersatz substitutes, barley coffee, synthetic fats, and paper-thin bread. For soldiers who had once thought of themselves as the elite warriors of Europe, it was humbling to realize that their enemies lived better even in captivity. Work details reinforced the collapse of old beliefs. Prisoners sent to farms or factories found themselves side by side with American civilians. Some farmers treated them kindly, offering sandwiches during lunch breaks. Children laughed and pointed at the enemy soldiers, picking cotton or harvesting wheat. To men who had expected to be paraded in chains, this casual, almost indifferent treatment was staggering. Not every American welcomed the prisoners. Some communities protested, angry that enemy soldiers were housed nearby. Yet even in places of hostility, the contrast remained. POWs saw guards bound by rules, not cruelty. They noticed that Americans argued freely, read newspapers with diverse opinions, and listened to music banned in Germany. In their captors' imperfections, they glimpsed freedom. The impact of these revelations cannot be overstated. Nazi propaganda had thrived by controlling information and isolating its people from foreign influence. But in captivity, German soldiers were immersed in a flood of contradictions. They saw that America was not weak, it was unimaginably rich. They realized that Americans did not fear culture, they celebrated it. They discovered that freedom, even in small gestures like jazz on a radio or a donut in a cafeteria, was more powerful than discipline enforced by fear. For many prisoners, this experience reshaped their worldview. Diaries and oral histories collected decades later reveal that former POWs remembered their captivity as the turning point in their lives. One admitted, "We learned in those camps what a free country looked like. We could not forget it." Another confessed that the first time he was handed a donut and coffee by a Red Cross woman, he felt shame for believing the lies I had been told. This transformation extended beyond individuals. When the war ended and the camps emptied, many former POWs carried their experiences back to Germany. They returned not only with stories of food and comfort, but also with tales of America's openness. They told families that even in defeat, prisoners had been treated with dignity. They described jazz bands, baseball games, and Hollywood films. They explained that the enemy had not been monsters, but ordinary people who lived with a confidence that came from freedom and abundance. The cultural effect was profound. In post-war Germany, American music, food, and films surged in popularity. Jazz and swing, once banned, now thrived. Coca-Cola and Lucky Strikes became symbols of modernity. And in quieter ways, the memory of POW camps shaped political attitudes. Many men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler returned skeptical of authoritarian promises, having glimpsed another model across the Atlantic. The irony was inescapable. Donuts and cigarettes, jazz, and Hollywood films. None of these were weapons of war. Yet they eroded the foundations of Nazi ideology more effectively than bullets. The Reich had built itself on the myth of superiority, but captivity in America revealed a humbling truth. The Allies had not only outgunned Germany, they had outlived its lies. Still, the transformation was not universal. Some prisoners clung to bitterness, refusing to accept the evidence before their eyes. A minority remained loyal to Nazi ideology even inside the camps, forming cliques that tried to punish fellow prisoners who showed admiration for America. Yet over time, even these hardened men found their influence waning. The reality of daily life, food, music, humanity, was too overwhelming to deny. In the end, the collapse of propaganda inside American POW camps was not just a victory of comfort over fear. It was a victory of openness over control, of abundance over scarcity, of culture over silence. It demonstrated that the most powerful blows to totalitarianism do not always come from tanks or bombers. Sometimes they come from donuts and cigarettes shared across barbed wire. It was a gray autumn morning in 1944 when a column of captured German soldiers trudged toward a new American camp in the Midwest. The air was sharp, their boots clattered against the gravel, and every step carried the weight of fear. They had heard whispers, rumors that prisoners in America were not starved or beaten, but those rumors seemed too good to be true. Most still expected the worst. As the barbed wire gates creaked open, the prisoners braced themselves. They imagined guards with clubs, barking orders, perhaps fists or rifle butts. Many felt their stomachs twist in anticipation of humiliation. Yet what awaited them was something they could not have imagined. Inside the gate stood a handful of American guards, relaxed but alert. Alongside them were women in Red Cross uniforms, smiling as though greeting guests rather than enemies. In their hands were trays piled with steaming donuts. Nearby, a large pot of coffee sent rich aromas drifting across the yard. One guard flicked open a lighter and casually offered cigarettes to the weary men. At first, the Germans froze. Suspicion clouded their faces. Was this some kind of trick? Some prisoners even refused at first, convinced the food might be poisoned or that mockery would follow. But hunger and exhaustion overcame hesitation. One man reached out, took a donut, and bit into it. His eyes widened in disbelief. The sweetness, the warmth, and the simple indulgence overwhelmed him. Around him, others followed. Soon the line of prisoners was munching pastries, sipping hot coffee, and drawing smoke from fresh cigarettes. The camp, once imagined as a place of torment, filled with the quiet murmur of astonishment. Some laughed nervously, the sound breaking the tension like glass shattering. Others lowered their heads, tears brimming as they tasted sugar for the first time in years. A few exchanged glances that said what none dared to voice aloud. This cannot be weakness. This is something else entirely. One young soldier whispered to his comrade, "If this is defeat, it tastes sweet." The words passed down the line, repeated in half-joking, half-reverent tones, until even the most hardened among them could not help but smirk. In that moment, the ground shifted beneath them. They had been taught that Americans were decadent and cowardly, yet here was a kind of strength that Germany could not match. To feed and comfort even the enemy required a confidence, a wealth, and a humanity that defied everything Nazi propaganda had preached. The realization spread slowly, but it was undeniable. Their guns had failed, their Reich was crumbling, and yet here they were, treated as men, not animals. The donuts, the cigarettes, and the coffee were not luxuries. They were symbols, symbols of abundance, of a nation so powerful that it could fight a global war and still offer kindness to its captives. The psychological impact was profound. The laughter that echoed through the camp that day was not the laughter of defiance, but of surrender, not just to the Americans, but to the reality that the world they had been promised was gone. For the prisoners, it was a turning point. The barbed wire still held them. The war was not yet over, but in their hearts, something had shifted. They had expected brutality and found generosity. They had been prepared for hatred and found humanity. And in that contrast, they began to understand that Germany's war was lost not only on the battlefield, but also in the realm of spirit and belief. That day, with donuts in their hands and cigarettes between their fingers, many German POWs realized that the Reich had lied to them. and that America's true power was not just in its tanks or planes, but in the quiet strength of compassion. In the end, the story of German POWs in America is not one of chains and cruelty, but of shock and revelation. Men who had marched into captivity expecting to be beaten discovered something else entirely. They found meals that filled their bellies, cigarettes that calmed their nerves, and donuts that reminded them of sweetness long forgotten. These were small things, mundane, almost trivial. And yet, for men raised on years of lies and hardened by battle, they carried a weight far heavier than any rifle. The irony is unmistakable. The Nazi state, obsessed with power and brutality, had built its rule on fear. It believed that domination came only from the fist, the boot, and the barrel of a gun. And yet, within the barbed wire of America's POW camps, that worldview crumbled under the force of simple kindness. A steaming mug of coffee, a cigarette lit by a guard's hand, a donut offered by a smiling Red Cross worker. These gestures were quiet, but they struck harder than artillery. For many prisoners, this was their first encounter with a society that treated even enemies with a measure of dignity. Some would later admit that their time in America transformed them more than years of Nazi indoctrination ever had. They saw that freedom and abundance produced not weakness, but strength. They saw that a confident nation could fight fiercely while still holding on to its humanity. The legacy of these experiences endured long after the war ended. When the camps emptied and the prisoners returned to Germany, they carried with them stories that seemed unbelievable to families scraping by on rations and ruins. They spoke of clean barracks, fair treatment, and food so plentiful that some had gained weight in captivity. They told of jazz bands and movies, of cigarettes passed around freely, of donuts so sweet they still lingered in memory decades later. These stories helped shape the image of America in post-war Europe. They fueled admiration, sometimes even envy, but above all, they planted the seeds of a different worldview. Many former POWs later became advocates for democracy in Germany, their experiences in captivity forming a quiet but powerful foundation for reconciliation. A few even returned to America permanently, drawn back by the strange kindness they had first encountered behind barbed wire. The larger truth is clear: wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by the ideas and values that endure when the guns fall silent. The German POWs who stepped off ships expecting brutality discovered that America's true arsenal was not just its tanks and planes, but also its ability to project confidence through generosity. Donuts and cigarettes became symbols of something larger, proof that power and humanity could exist side by side. It is a lesson that still resonates today. For in every war, there are moments when the smallest gestures carry the greatest meaning. A smile, a meal, a song. These can fracture the hardest walls of ideology and propaganda. As we close this chapter, one question remains. If donuts and cigarettes could undermine the myths of the Reich, what other quiet weapons shaped the outcome of World War II? In the next story, we'll explore how German POWs carried American culture, music, movies, even Coca-Cola, back across the Atlantic, changing the world long after the fighting stopped.